All right, folks, welcome back. Our next session, Ravensbrück. You know, many people don't appreciate that there's a Nazi concentration camp in northern Germany exclusively for women, you know, from 1939 to 1945. And today we get to hear about the lives of women imprisoned in the Ravensbrück concentration camp with discussions from authors Lynne Olson and Gwen Strauss. Together they tell stories of courage, of solidarity, and resilience among the female prisoners, including stories of sisterhood, love, and survival amidst unimaginable hardship. Now, chairing this session is Dr. Nick Mueller, founding president and CEO, emeritus of the National World War II Museum. Nick, I don't think you need any further introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Nick Mueller.
I'm nowhere near just being introduced by just my name, but I'll tell you, Stephen Ambrose, some years ago when I introduced him to a group like this somewhere out of town, I went on for about 5 minutes and he said, Nick, he said, you're cutting into my speaking time. Just say Steve Ambrose. Anyway, I'm no Steve Ambrose, so anyhow. Well, look, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this session. I really helped put it together with these two wonderful women and scholars and authors, great historians who've both spoken here at this conference before, and who I have had and do have the opportunity to work with. Gwen, I'm helping out with a program over in France, an artisan residency program that she is leading, and it's now called the Dorimar Cultural Center. And it's just a wonderful institution with artists and philosophers and historians and so forth that come together there every year. And I'm fortunate to be in a position to help. And Lynne Olson was also recruited to be our consultant and to teach me a lot about the home front and the arsenal of democracy when that exhibit was being developed. Both of these authors have multiple books to their credit, best-selling books, and you're going to hear about their most recent ones. And they are extraordinary works of literature and history that I think is going to surprise you and shock you in many different ways. The books that they've both written are in your program, so be sure to look at those, and they'll, of course, be signing some afterwards. And for this session, they both share a story around Ravensbrück. As Mike just mentioned, a prison camp for women that we knew very little about until about 10 or 15 years ago. It was maybe a little bit earlier than that, but liberated by the Soviets and after the Cold War, for various reasons, neither side wanted to say much about it until after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then scholars began to get into the Soviet archives and other archives that began to tell this horrific story. So it's one that will both shock you and inspire you by the women and the courage that they displayed under incredible conditions. The brutality, the murder of these women, the gas chambers that we didn't know anything about is just incredible and almost indescribable and unbelievable as you read their stories. They're stories of resistance and horror, brutality, as I just said, but also where the idea of freedom managed to persist amid the evils of this Nazi concentration camp and the racist terror that accompanied it. Gwen's story is a sequel of her The Nine, which she spoke on here a couple years ago, and Lynne's sequel from Madame Fourcade. So resistance is part of the subtext for both of these stories. So I want to welcome you all to another session here at this museum, and everyone is looking forward. I'm not sure which one of you wants to go first, but you're going first. Okay, so I think we agreed on that. I just forgot. All right.
Hello, thank you. First, I want to just thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Nick for inviting me and this incredible organization here. It's just phenomenal. As he said, I spoke a few years ago, and it was the highlight of my year, and I think this will be, again, the highlight of my year. So I'm really, really honored to be here, and I'm honored to be sharing the stage with Lynne. She's an incredible historian and writer. So I'm talking about my recent book, Milena and Margarete, and I think I'm just going to do, I want to, leave a lot unsaid so that you'll buy the book. But I'm going to give a little introduction into who are Milena and Margarete, and also why I wrote this book. And I can start that with this story. The reason that I found this story is that many years ago, I lived on a small sailboat with my first love. I was sort of 17, 18 years old, and I had bought this copy of Kafka's Letters to Milena at a used bookstore. And you don't have a lot to do at sea, so I read it rather obsessively. And if you don't know the book, it's a one-way correspondence. It's Kafka's letters that he wrote to Milena. He destroyed the letters that she wrote to him. So you have just his words, but you can sort of tell what she's saying back to him. And basically, she's really brave. She's saying, come on, let's get together, let's be together. And he's sort of, I don't know if it's going to work out. If you know Kafka, he's very anxious. And as I was reading this, as I was living on that boat, I was basically like Kafka. I was sort of driving the guy I was with crazy by asking him pretty much all the time, do you still love me? And, eventually he stopped answering, which I understand. So I was reading this book obsessively, wanting to be like Milena, but I was more like Kafka. And, oops, it went back. And but the book that I had, it only had her name. It didn't have her last name. She was just Milena, the receiver of these letters. This keeps going automatically. And there's a reason why that was. There was no bio about her. There was nothing. So she was a mystery. So flash forward 40 years, and I'm doing research for my last book. I'm in Ravensbrück in the archive, and I run across this phrase, Kafka's Milena. And it's like a bolt of lightning. There she is. There's Milena. I start to talk to historians about her. She's extraordinary. And that began. One of the historians said to me, she is extraordinary. She's a personality at Ravensbrück. She's a really important person. But there's also this other story. There's this love story, which many people know, but it hasn't really been written about. So that was like, I want to know more about that. So who is Milena? She was from Czech. She was from Prague. She was born in Prague. She's a Czech person, a wild, kind of free-spirited young woman. She goes to the school called Minerva, which was one of the first lycées that actually gave a full education to girls, the same education that boys got. They were quite emancipated. She was notoriously emancipated. She had both male and female lovers. She experimented with morphine. She had kind of a loose idea about ownership. She would always take her father's things and give them to her friends. She was a bit, she was a lot to handle. He was a very famous, wealthy surgeon, oral surgeon and professor. And at one point, he did what many men could do at that time, husbands or fathers, when you had uncontrollable daughters or wives, he put her in an asylum. And, but Milena had extraordinary powers of persuasion, which would serve her all the way through her life. And she talked the nurses onto her side. She got the key to the door. She was able to continue with her lover at the time, Ernst Polak, and then they went to Vienna and married. She then began her correspondence with Kafka. She was one of the first people to recognize his genius. She was his first translator, and he was completely not known at that time. So she was kind of extraordinary that way. She became later a journalist. She was vehemently anti-fascist. She sort of, kind of like a Cassandra figure, I would say. She was writing about the plight of Jews in Europe long before many others. She even had a dream about the Holocaust, which she published, and it's incredibly about the trains. I mean, she's sort of this amazing, free-thinking, forward-thinking person. When the Nazis come into Prague, she immediately goes into action. She calls all her Jewish friends. She says, I'm here for you. She begins a network to help them escape. She helps even her lover at the time escape. She says, I'm coming, I'll follow. Of course, she doesn't. And for a while, she outsmarts the Gestapo. It's quite hilarious the way she does. But in the end, of course, she's arrested and sent to Ravensbrück, where she meets this woman, who's Margarete Berber-Neumann. Now, Margarete, I hope I pronounced that right. Margarete is German. She's born in Potsdam. She first marries Raphael Berber, who's the son of Martin Berber, who wrote I and Thou, the famous Jewish philosopher. But she's swept up, I don't know why this does, she's swept up, I'm gonna go backwards. She's swept up in the fervor and the revolution of that time, and she falls in love with Heinz Neumann, who's the head of the German Communist Party. He's quite close to Stalin, which is not a great thing to be. And so first they're sent to Spain, and then they're called back to Moscow. Both Margarete and Heinz knew at that time that it was probably a death sentence, but Heinz was such a true-blooded, Bolshevik revolutionary that he says, no, we must go. And sure enough, when they go back to Moscow, he's executed in one of the many purges that Stalin was doing at that time. And she's sent to the Gulag. She's sent to Kazakhstan, to Karaganda Gulag in 1938. And then she's there for 2 years, and she's suddenly traded. This happens in her life. She's got, my God, has amazing timing. She's goes to the Gulag when in this little teeny period when it wasn't absolutely deadly, and then she's traded before it becomes deadly again. So this is the non-aggression treaty between Stalin and Hitler. Stalin trades her in a prison trade. She thinks she's going to be executed, and instead she's sent to Ravensbrück. And this is really the subject of the same subject that Lynne and I are both talking about in our books, which is what is this place, Ravensbrück? It's the only concentration camp built for women. There's roughly 120,000 women and 20,000 men from 30 nations. It's from 1939 to 1945. It's liberated finally by the Russians. It's the second largest concentration camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau, and it's only 90 miles north of Berlin. It becomes a kind of it's sort of a labor camp. At first, when Margarete arrives from the Gulag, it's relatively nice, She's sort of surprised because the Gulag was really bad, and here it's not overcrowded. She's not. It doesn't have lice everywhere. She has her own bed. There's food. Of course, it will descend into hell, and she will witness that descent. She and Milena, but it's at the beginning. It was okay, but at the end, it's really become sort of the center point of crimes against women's bodies, as Nick talks about. It's a horrific place. In the end, there are gas chambers. There's a crematorium. There's selection by death, executions. There's medical experiments. The things that happen there are really horrific. And they Milena and Margarete have sort of decided that they're going to bear witness to this. Against this backdrop, so the question for me as a writer was, how can there be a love story, and how do I write about it? Milena, this drawing is by one of Milena's friends, a Czech artist that was there with her, Nina Jerskova. And there was this whole artistic community in the camp. And then there was these different groups, the Czech group, and but what I wanted to say was Milena and Greta held these positions of privilege in the camp. That's important to understand. They arrive early. They're both political prisoners. They speak German, and so they both have important jobs. Milena's working in the infirmary because a lot of the Nazi doctors were actually students of her father, and they're kind of impressed by her. They want to impress her. She has a kind of bearing that even the SS want to impress her. And she gets away with a lot of things, which terrifies Margarete. But they decide they're going to write a book about about Stalin and Hitler, and I think that stance of bearing witness gives them the motivation to continue. But again, how to write about these two women, about their relationship is complicated by all kinds of about the language that was available to them, how they self-identified, and I don't know, it keeps going forward, but I'm sorry, you get a preview. That basically, there's this term that they use, which is passionate friends, versus the term lesbian. And this is complicated partly by the camp caste system, in the system, which I'm sure you all know. There's the top of the heap, which are the political prisoners. They're the red triangle. In Ravensbrück next, there's sort of the what they call the common criminals, and then there's the Jehovah's Witness, and then there's the asocial, which are the gypsies, the Roma and Sinti, the homeless people, often war widows, prostitutes, and lesbians. And the word prostitute and lesbian are sort of interchangeable at that point. And I should explain that there's no pink triangles in the women's camps, because that's the triangle for homosexuals, but that's only a male status, because the German Criminal Code, paragraph 175, made male homosexuality illegal. It's kind of interesting and actually a little bit funny, because German lawmakers spend a lot of time talking about this. Basically, they think that sex has to be penetrative, and they spend a lot of time talking about what constitutes penetrative sex in the discussions. And since they think women can't have that kind of sex, women can't have sex. Therefore, lesbians can't exist. So it's this kind of weird logic. So it's not actually explicitly illegal, but of course, in this highly patriarchal German society, it's completely a precarious position to be in. If you're a known lesbian, you can be blackmailed, you can lose your job, you don't have the protection of a man or a husband or a father. You're often left homeless, and so a lot of lesbians were picked up for degeneracy, homelessness, etc., and really their crime was being lesbians. In the camp, it is expressly illegal, and it's punishable by 25 lashings, which is deadly for most women at that point. So there was a lot at stake to not speak of it, and how do you write about something that's not in the archive, that's between the lines, that's in the margins? That was one of the challenges of this book. And the other challenge, of course, is the whole historiography of Ravensbrück, which I think we can talk about more, but the Ravensbrück is liberated by the Soviets. It becomes a Soviet camp. Then 3 years after the war, it's bulldozed. They wanted to build a shopping mall there, but some survivors stopped that from happening. It becomes really a marginalized place in the history. It's a shrine. It's a Soviet shrine against the fascist capitalist West. And Milena is erased from the history completely, hence why she is just a name in the book that I had 40 years earlier on my sailboat, because all the acts of bravery that she did, all the incredible things that she did to save people in the camp, as her position as in the infirmary, and with Greta, they worked hard to save people's lives, and all the things that Milena did before being deported in Prague, all of that was erased. And in fact, those acts were appropriated by communist leaders in Czechoslovakia. So they took the things they did and they claimed them as their own acts. So if she's even mentioned, she's sort of mentioned as the sort of bourgeois degenerate friend of the bourgeois degenerate author Kafka. So she's erased from the history. And of course, the plight of Jews, we've talked, I think, in the talk about Nuremberg, they speak of this, the death of Jews, the execution of gypsies, so-called asocials, etc. That's also not spoken about in the history. That's not part of the narrative. And finally, one of the things that I found shocking in my research is that many of the women who survived Ravensbrück, who went home, didn't talk about it because there was a shame attached to having been there. If you had survived, it was assumed that you did something to survive, possibly prostitute yourself, or you were raped, or whatever it was. Basically, you were no longer pure, and you were no longer marriageable, so it became a kind of unspoken, it was a secret amongst many survivors. They didn't want to talk about it. So, oops, that's the wrong direction. So this changes, of course, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Sorry, I'm having a slide. Then Milena is really rediscovered and talked about again, and her journalism is republished. The acts of bravery, people recognize that people constitute a dossier about her, all the things that she did. And Yad Vashem in 1994 recognizes her as one of the righteous among nations. And all of her, she suddenly is someone who's spoken about. Margarete wrote a book about Milena in 1966 called Milena, which she talks about her passionate friend, and describes the incredible love and story between the two of them, and the fact that they both lived for each other and saved each other's lives multiple times. And she opens the book with this sentence: "I was so glad I was sent to Ravensbrück because there I met Milena." Thank you. I don't know what to do.
I would just like to repeat what Gwen said about being here. I was telling Nick last night, I regard this as my second home. I mean, I have been affiliated in some way with the museum for I don't know how long. I mean, I remember when I first came, we were talking about the construction of this hotel. That's how long ago it has been. And some of my happiest times in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years have been here at this museum. It is just a marvel, and I, as a writer-historian, can't thank Nick and Stephen and everybody else enough for doing what they've done to create this absolute triumph of a place. So thank you. And one of the great things about it is that when I have come, especially at these conferences, I meet so many people that I've read their books, but have never met. And Gwen is one of them. I didn't know her before last night. Now we're bosom buddies. So seriously, we are going to be working together, I think, in some way. So that is just one of the many, many, many advantages of being affiliated with the World War II Museum. So I'm going to talk about the French. I'd like to take you back to a cold January morning in 1944. On that morning, Geneviève de Gaulle, the niece of General Charles de Gaulle, stood at attention in a square of a German transit camp about 50 miles from Paris. Grouped around her were more than 900 other women, all of them members of the French resistance, who, like Geneviève, had been transferred to the camp from jails and prisons throughout France. Geneviève was stunned, not only by the number of women around her, but also by the great diversity among them. Some belonged to intelligence units, she later wrote. Others had hidden Allied flyers who were shot down over France. Still others had given refuge to those clandestinely sent by the Free French from London to France. They ranged from doctors, teachers, artists, and lawyers to housewives, florists, civil servants, and seamstresses. Every morning at the transit camp, the Germans called the roll of names of the prisoners there. Geneviève vividly recalled the scene. As each name was shouted out, she said, "A woman stepped forward." There were very young girls and grandmothers, pregnant women, robust rural workers, and elegant city girls. Despite the tragedy of the hour, we looked at each other with joy and pride. It was an extraordinary image of the strength of the resistance and of France. Besides fighting the Germans, these women had been revolutionaries on another level. They had defied not only the Germans, but also their own deeply conservative patriarchal society, in which women were largely confined to the roles of wives and mothers and still did not have the right to vote. We're talking 1940s. Women did not have the right to vote in France. None of these constraints, however, had stopped them. One of them would write later, "We committed ourselves to fight for the freedom of a country that refused to give us basic human freedoms. But it was still our country, and we were prepared to die for it." A month later, Geneviève de Gaulle and the hundreds of women standing around her were all sent to Ravensbrück. When they arrived, they were in total shock at the horror they found there. In Geneviève's words, "We had been dropped into an unknown land, a universe that was not only terrifying, but absurd, contrary to everything we knew." One morning, shortly after they arrived, these French newcomers received a surreptitious visit from a fellow Frenchwoman who had been in the camp for 5 months. Her name was Germaine Tillion. She was an anthropologist, the French equivalent of the American anthropologist Margaret Mead. When Germaine arrived in Ravensbrück in October 1943, she began a new anthropological study, this one about the workings of the camp itself. Gwen and I had breakfast this morning, and we were talking about, because we both ran across our characters. I ran across her characters when I was doing research. She ran across my characters when she was doing research. And one of the wonderful things about Germaine had been an anthropologist in the mountains of Algeria. She had been studying fierce Berber tribes for about 6 years before her resistance work began. And she was told, she was in her 20s when she went, and she was told by French officials who were aghast at the idea that she would want to do this, that these men were murderers. These Berbers were murderers, the Bedouins. They were going to kill her. And she basically said, oh, that's even more reason that I should go. And she had a fantastic time. They treated her extremely well. So she acquired all this research and notes and records and everything. And when she was in jail after when she was arrested by the Gestapo, she's put in jail in France, in Paris, for more than a year. And then she was sent to Ravensbrück. And of course, none of these women knew what to expect. They had no idea. Germaine thought, maybe, okay, I'm going to work in the fields and I'll have time to write my dissertation there. So there's wonderful descriptions of her when she was sent on the train to go to Ravensbrück. She had a huge hemp sack filled with her research, just huge. This woman was very short, and so she was dragging this hemp sack on the train. But once she got to Ravensbrück, it disappeared, and she never saw any of her research materials again. So in place of working on her dissertation, she did an anthropological study of Ravensbrück itself, about the workings of the camp. By doing so, she had turned the tables on the camp's system of domination and dehumanization, becoming an investigator, a hunter rather than the hunted. Germaine's study also allowed her to remove herself emotionally from Ravensbrück's horror, to give her the professional distance she needed to control her own fear and to help others do the same. On that frigid morning in February 1944, Germaine had come to the newcomers' barracks to tell them what she had learned about the functioning of Ravensbrück, seemingly absurd in many ways, but actually following a certain logic. She said later, "Nothing is more terrifying than a complete mystery. By explaining these mysteries, I was conscious of giving a degree of moral strength to my comrades. If you can understand a mechanism that crushes you, if you can mentally dismantle its springs and consider in all its details an apparently hopeless situation, that can become a powerful source of composure, serenity, and fortitude." Germaine advised Geneviève and other newcomers, most of them who were in their, Germaine at that point was in her 30s. Geneviève was 22, and there were others even younger. So most of them were very young. They were in their teens or early 20s. She advised them that the single most important thing in their lives from then on was to form tight bonds with one another. Without that, she said, none of them would survive. They must also do their best to stand up to the Germans. Still in shock from her first view of the camp, Geneviève de Gaulle was, as she put it, amazed and filled with admiration by Germaine's analysis. "The first thing she did was give us knowledge," Geneviève said after the war. "That was a lifesaver for me. When you understand, you can fight back." In the midst of unimaginable horror, that's exactly what dozens of these French women did. Calling themselves maquis, maquis is a term that refers to French resistance fighters. They sought to avoid any labor that could contribute to the German war effort, and if possible, any work at all. A Polish survivor recalled how the French women audaciously opposed the authorities' orders, and always with a great deal of bravura. As the camp became more crowded and chaotic, the French became increasingly adept at avoiding any kind of labor. They disguised themselves as stooped old women and mixed in with the elderly inmates assigned to knitting and sewing. They slipped in among the women who worked at night and went to the barracks to sleep during the day. They hid under the bunks and in the washrooms. It was, one of them said, a life full of adventure. The game consisted of inventing 1,000 ingenious and very risky strategies for this purpose. We French were particularly good at it. Another referred to herself and her French compatriots as, quote, the queens of irregularity, of indiscipline, of sabotage by omission. Decades after the war, Germaine Tillion and Geneviève de Gaulle took part in a long televised conversation about their Ravensbrück experiences that, among other things, noted the French women's determination to cause trouble. In that conversation, Geneviève said, the inmates from other countries were completely flabbergasted by our recklessness. It even made them angry. We weren't considered serious people. Germaine nodded and said with a laugh, we made fun of everything. She certainly did. During the endless roll calls at Ravensbrück, she would invent jokes to pass on to those around her. She said later, distancing oneself from the horror was important, and humor creates an enormous distance. It allows you to survive. In the words of another member of the sisterhood, we laughed to prove to ourselves that we were still alive, that we were still able to react. To laugh is to resist. Laughter was just one of many weapons the French women used in their defiance of the determination of camp officials to crush them. Some came up with word games. Others gave lectures on such subjects as French art and culture, gardening, cooking, and the history of man. The history of man was, not surprisingly, Germaine Tillion's idea. Still others recited poetry. Jacqueline d'Alincourt, who is one of the book's four main characters, transcribed in tiny writing a number of poems by French poets and bound the pages to circulate among her friends. Germaine Tillion, for her part, wrote a satirical musical review about Ravensbrück, never intended to be performed, but to be sung in secret in the barracks. Hearing the laughter during one such session, a German guard shouted at the French women, "Mesdames, how can you laugh when you are here to die?" These are the women I write about in the Sisterhood of Ravensbrück. It's my 10th book, and it follows in the footsteps of the two books that I wrote right before it, both of them about history-making, yet relatively unknown women in the French resistance. For several decades following the war, histories of the French resistance, which were written almost exclusively by men, largely ignored the contributions of women. Until my book, Madame Foucault's Secret War, was published in 2019, historians, for example, continued to persist in the belief that no women led a resistance organization. In fact, as I made clear, Marie-Madeleine Foucault was not only a resistance chief, but the head of what became the largest and most important Allied intelligence network in France. That book, as it happened, was part of an explosion of biographies of French resistance over the last few years. These books focused on the extraordinary exploits of French women in helping defeat the Germans. But almost none of them, including my own, paid much attention to what happened to the women afterwards, particularly to the large numbers, more than 10,000, who were captured and sent to various German prisons and concentration camps. Even less attention has been paid to the fact that a good number of these women continued to resist the Germans in the camps, particularly at Ravensbrück. It's an untold story, and that's why I decided to tell it. About half the book deals with these women's early lives, their resistance activities, and what happened to them at Ravensbrück. The second half talks about what happened after the war, how they joined forces again, just as they had done at the camp, to help each other heal their bodies and minds, and to build a new future for themselves and the world. But they also banded together to make it clear to the world what they had done during the war. They were responding to the reality that after the war, as I indicated before, women in the resistance were treated as an afterthought. The people in France were encouraged by Charles de Gaulle and male resistance leaders to believe that the resistance was an entirely male affair, which is incredibly awful considering that de Gaulle's own niece had been a leader in the French resistance. In fact, without women, the resistance would never have gotten off the ground. Women kick-started the first organized resistance network in France and performed much of the essential work from then on, even as men took over virtually all the leadership positions. In refusing to acknowledge this fact, de Gaulle and other resistance leaders reflected the deep-rooted sexism of the country's society at the time. In their view, men fought and women stayed home. The women survivors of Ravensbrück refused to accept such misogyny. They created a post-war organization to provide support for the women survivors of German camps and prisons, and to bring to the public's attention the accomplishments and sacrifices of all women in the resistance. By forming an all-female activist organization, they were giving notice that they would not retreat into the shadows. They had taken the same risks as men in defense of their country, had suffered the same brutal punishments, and now had united to care for one another and obtain rights and recognition that they had legitimately earned. Together in the post-war world, the Sisterhood of Ravensbrück continued their crusade against injustice and reaffirmed their commitment to human freedom and dignity. They became champions of France's reconciliation with Germany, despite their suffering at the hands of the Nazis, believing that the only hope for a lasting peace lay in the creation of a unified Europe. Having been responsible in part for French women finally getting the right to vote in 1944, some were also leaders in the long, arduous uphill battle after the war to achieve other major rights for women, including the right to an abortion. I'd like to close by emphasizing that above all, this is a story of the extraordinary power of love and friendship. Many years after the war, one of the women I write about declared, "I have never experienced such strong demonstrations of solidarity and sharing as among my fellow prisoners. We have withstood these trials by sticking together. Together, we were able to overcome them. It is together that we came out of the hell of the camps. It was together that we were able to continue to live afterwards, welded together by this invisible thread of infamy and courage. Alone, we would never have survived. This is what I want people to understand. I will testify to it until my final breath, before the world forgets." Thank you.
Well, I think everyone is sufficiently motivated now to buy these two wonderful, wonderful books. They are page turners, I promise you, and you will be inspired and, as I said earlier, shocked in many cases. But the courage of these women is it's something. Let me just ask both of you a little bit. You've talked briefly about some of your main characters who you were able to talk to or left notes. But both before Ravensbrück and after, you all have done prodigious research in different ways, but in similar ways too. And Why don't you just talk about your research? The forensics of your investigations are just phenomenal when you're reading and say, how did they know this? Where did they find this? And of course you tell us, but it's still surprising, and I think the audience would like to hear.
Yes, so as I alluded in my talk, it's a little bit tricky sometimes to write about marginalized characters, people who aren't in the archive. But people like Milena and Margarete, they have a bigger footprint. So there were books, I found books written about them and books that they wrote. And for example, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, an envelope of letters that Milena wrote to her daughter and father in the camp, those were found. I interviewed a lot of historians of the current head and the former head of the Ravensbrück Memorial. And then, of course, archives. That's like my happy place. I love going into archives, into libraries, and trying to find as many original survivor accounts. This book, because one was Czech and one was German, was a little bit more tricky because those are not languages I speak. So I had to get friends to translate, and I, work sometimes a little bit at a distance. But it's really fun. Was there
a single biggest breakthrough discovery?
For me, it was discovering a lot of writings by Milena's daughter, Honza, who had a very troubled and terrible life. I had to kind of cut that part out of the book because my editor was like, this is too depressing. but she lived, of course, behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia, and with a mother that was, you couldn't talk about. And grew up, and so she was very much part of the underground movement, the resistance movement in Czechoslovakia against the Soviets. And her writings about her mother were really interesting. Yeah.
And Kafka, Milena's story was also revealing too. And a piece of the whole story.
Definitely, but again, Kafka was really, for a long time in the Soviet Union, he was a degenerate writer. Then he gets kind of revised a little teeny bit, and even in that point when he suddenly, you can read Kafka, Milena is just a whore, really, like they talk about her in this terrible way, really awful way. So it's really, she's really doesn't get her full due until afterwards,
Well, actually, when I was looking around for the subject of this now book, what intrigued me initially was not any of the characters that I've talked about. The book focuses on 4 women. They were very, very close. I mean, they felt like they were sisters. But it wasn't one of them that really got my attention. It was a woman named Germaine de Renty, who does play a fairly large role in the book, but she is not one of the 4 main characters. And the reason I was fascinated by her, she was a countess. So she came from her husband came from, an aristocratic family. They were big socialites in Paris, but they were also members of Marie-Madeleine Foucault's intelligence group. And they both were arrested by the Gestapo and sent to prison, he to Buchenwald, she to Ravensbrück. And so what seemed to be this very fragile socialite from Paris turned out to be one of the strongest women at Ravensbrück. She made it out alive and basically totally redid her life afterwards, and I go into great detail about that. But what really interested me was the fact that she had no money when she came out, like many of the women, so she had to make a living, and she did it by taking in college students, most of them from the United States. They boarded with her while they were on their junior year abroad. And one of them was Jacqueline Bouvier from Vassar. And I was very interested in that fact. And then I learned that Germaine was really kind of became second mother to Jacqueline Kennedy, and basically taught her about beauty. I mean, Germaine de Renty was devoted to finding beauty after the horror of Ravensbrück. So she was her mentor, and taking her to museums and taking her to, going to flea markets, to walking through the French neighborhoods to talk about the beauty of France, of Paris. And she was the mentor to Jacqueline Kennedy, who then went on to redo the White House and became a huge figure in American historic preservation. So that was the story that I found out about. I'm like, God, this is fascinating. And so it led me into doing French women sent to Ravensbrück. Unlike Gwen, I had really quite it was fairly easy to do the research. Most of these women, they were all gone. They were all dead when I started, but I talked to a number of their family members and to people who knew them, and they all but one wrote, the four that I write about, wrote memoirs. And there is a ton of stuff about them. I mean, written by other people, most of it in French, but my best source by far was the result of a young American filmmaker in the 80s fell in love with Jacqueline Dallencourt, who I mentioned. She's one of the four, and decided to make a documentary about them, about the French women at Ravensbrück. And it took her like 6 or 7 years. And she wasn't a filmmaker. She was a reporter at that point for U.S. News and World Report. And she taught herself how to be a documentary filmmaker and spent 6 or 7, 8 years working on this documentary. And the four women that are my main figures are her main figures in this documentary. And she, I think, compiled like almost 30 hours of interviews. She did 30 hours of interviews over the course of those many years of them separately and together about the early lives, about their resistance work, about what it was like in Ravensbrück. And the documentary came out in 1991, I believe. You can see it. You go to Vimeo and for $3.99 you can rent it. It's fantastic. Wow. But it's only an hour. But she did all these incredible interviews with them, and the transcripts are available in the French archives. So that was a gold mine. That was these women who were as close as sisters, maybe even closer than sisters, until the end of their lives. They stayed close from the 1940s and most of them lived until the 2000s. And what that meant, what Ravensbrück had done to them, how they could have survived, and it was only through their friendship with each other. And that was just, as I said, it was gold. If you get that kind of stuff, I mean, to bring a subject alive, you need that all the human detail that you can find, and those transcripts really provided it.
Can I add just because it's the way our stories weave together? Germaine Tillon is a very close friend for life with Margarete Berber-Neumann, and one of the ways I learned about Milena was from Tillon talking about her. She says at one point, there's the political prisoners that used their power and privilege to help themselves and their friends, and then there were the political prisoners that used their power and privilege to help everyone, and one of those was Milena.
Just to add to what Gwen said, the closeness between Greta and Germaine, which was true for the rest of their lives. Yeah. In the worst part of the Ravensbrück, just basically as the war was coming to an end and the Germans were trying to kill everybody at Ravensbrück, there was a scene that Greta was in the infirmary recovering from a bad typhoid or something, a really bad illness, and Germaine Tillon would have been killed that day. But her friends smuggled her into the ward where Greta was and hid her in Greta's bed. She actually was on top of Germaine when the Germans swept through to find the woman that they had set out to kill that day, and Germaine was there, and they never discovered her because Greta hid her.
And a little bit about Germaine, she wrote afterwards from her little scraps of paper and stuff. Why don't you all talk about, she had hid them everywhere and with other prisoners and places, but she reconstructed it afterwards, and that is a part of the story too, of how she brought her memory back to life.
Right. I mean, Germaine is so important for so many reasons. What I talked about in my speech, but also what Nick said. I mean, she was really the first historian of Ravensbrück. Yeah. She collected all those. She set out to basically bear witness to what had happened to all of them, not just to her and to the French women, but to everybody. And she was the first to write a book about Ravensbrück, and she continued adding to that book.
She did, I think, 4 editions.
She wrote 4 editions. So she was really, really important. The other important thing about her was that she bore witness when the Algerian War broke out. She was one of the major French intellectuals after the war, no question, one of the foremost. And she went to Algeria. She had worked in Algeria. And she bore witness to the fact that the French were acting like the Germans in their treatment of the Algerians. And we were talking about this morning. She came under huge criticism from people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone Beauvoir. And she refused to back down. She said, we have been through, you guys haven't been through, we have been through what the Germans did, and what the French, our countrymen are doing is the same thing as the Germans.
Yeah, Germaine was really important for both my last book and this book, all of the things that she wrote and talked about. And yes, she sort of galvanized this. There was the movement against the French crimes in Algeria was really galvanized by survivors. Yeah.
One thing, Gwen, about your book that I found interesting is, would you talk about the Eastern Europe, Central Europe, as we referred to it in the West during the Cold War, but before the war, that whole part of Central Europe is not really talked about much in terms of the post-war era in the writings, but the intellectual ferment that was going on there between communism and fascism in the 30s, late 20s and 30s. Journalists and philosophers and theologians, and Milena is kind of in the mix of all of that, and so is Margarete. And in a way, you begin to see these forces of 2 competing ideologies at a time when democracies are thought of as weak and passive and on the way out. And of course, the Great Depression is going on, and everybody blamed the United States for that. And so these were ideologies of the future, and you talk about how they kind of flirted with these and really became communists and then disaffected. And I think that's a very fascinating. Would you want to talk about
absolutely.
that?
I think,
journalist? I mean, she was.
So Milena flirted with communism a little bit. Because it was, it was part of the times. This is the end of all these empires. The German, Austro-Hungary, that empire has fallen. The Kaiser's fallen. And for the first time, Czechoslovakia can be a country itself, so there's all these ideas about what kind of government do we want, and Milena, there is this idea of communism because of course there's the Bolshevik Revolution, and there's been World War I, and all of this slaughter of World War I. We don't want that to happen again, So she flirts with it. She's definitely the kind of person that cannot be part of any kind of organization that tells her what to do or think. So I think within a couple of months, she ends up slapping the head of the Communist Party and says no, and walks away. And that was the end for her. And she had a real nose for fascism and for any kind of impingement on human dignity and human rights. Margarete is a little bit more complicated. She's in Germany in that period of that incredible turmoil of the 20s and 30s when there's a new government all the time, and there is the military, the old military that's trying to retake power, and they think, oh, Hitler, we can use him, and so she's on the other side. She's part of this movement towards this idea of this world revolution where we won't have kings and emperors anymore, and it'll be the people that control. But she, as we know, Stalin is not. He's not about collective. He's a dictator. He's a fascist. And he and Hitler form an alignment at one point at the beginning. So there's and that's complicated for all these communists, especially in the camp, who are hardcore political communists and love Stalin and the Bolshevik Revolution. And then there's this, this non-aggression pact, and there's this kind of like, Margarete describes it in the Gulag when they learned that this had happened. This kind of this cognitive dissonance. How do we make these 2 things whole? It's not possible that Stalin could be in alignment with Hitler. And when Margarete gets to the camp, it pits her against a lot of the political prisoners. So a lot of the political prisoners, at least in the early years in Ravensbrück, are German communists that were arrested by the Nazis and thrown into prison. And they're at the top of the heap in that camp caste system. And Greta is a political prisoner, but she's an anti-Stalinist, and they think she's a plant. They think she's a spy that's been sent to talk bad about, their dear Stalin. But of course, she finds alliances in the political class amongst the Poles, because the Poles have no illusions about Stalin. And so she becomes quite close to the Polish political prisoners. Yes, but it's a complicated nuance, and even in the camp, there's a moment when I think there was a group of, it's in the infirmary, there's a group of Czechs and a group of Poles and a group of maybe a Russian, all discussing like who's worse, Hitler or Stalin, and most of them are saying Hitler, of course, and Milena's like, I don't think so, and then she sort of says, this is you can't make a decision between these two things. They're both terrible. Yeah.
It's complicated.
It's complicated, exactly.
But the interesting thing is these competing totalitarian absolutist ideologies, despite the aspirational or inspirational elements of it, world revolution, and we're not going to have kings and monarchs anymore, and then how they become disillusioned. Margarete, as the communist, ends up in a gulag.
Yeah, and then traded back.
Traded back. So it's a very insightful area. But and they come down, and the French resistors too, who are Ravensbrück, they come down on liberty and independence, and they're in the midst of this horrible camp. It's understanding, as you all were saying, that gave them. If you can understand the cruelty that's going on and how the machine works, you can have freedom. There's a moment of liberty even within that by understanding. It's a different version of what I said yesterday. The purpose of learning is to free people. The knowledge, it frees people.
Yeah, in fact, to echo what you said about Germain using being an anthropologist as a stance, Greta and Milena decide they're going to write a book. And they're going to write a book about these two worlds, Stalin and Hitler in the concentration camp. And that puts them in the stance of bearing witness, and that gives them a way to continue and a kind of solidarity. It gives them a moral purpose that, so again,
Yep. Well, thank you guys. This is really great. Let's open up Jeremy for some questions.
Thank you, Lynn and Gwen. Raise your hands and we'll bring microphones to you. We're going to start to your right, towards the front, please.
Thanks. Another great topic that probably many of us didn't know anything about. Of the 120,000 prisoners, were any of them women that were segregated or pulled from other camps from their families, or were these all political prisoners and resistance fighters?
You want to answer? No, they're definitely, some of them even come from Auschwitz. Yeah. They come from all the different camps, and then they're also, Ravensbrück becomes kind of a center spot for them, for the SS. They make a lot of money off of these women. They basically select them as enslaved labor for their different commandos, or little sub-camps. So they're selected, they're basically worked to death, that's the plan, or then sent to Auschwitz to be gassed. But if they're young and strong, or if they're smart and can stay, they figure out a way to survive. But basically, they come from all the different camps, they come from all over the world, and there are waves of them. There's the waves of the Poles, there's the waves of the Hungarians. It depends on where the Nazis are invading at that time. And they also, later in the camp, in one of the more horrific periods in the camp, they come with children. And a lot of them have come pregnant. So there's a whole horrendous chapter of what happens to these children that are born in the camp.
Next question's in the center with Connie.
So did Ravensbrück have ovens, a way to dismiss these people?
They had crematoriums. They had a crematorium. Initially, Gwen referred to the fact that there was gas chamber, but that was very late in the game. It was basically because they were trying desperately to kill as many as they could toward the end of the war. They didn't want to have any alive. There were a lot alive at the end of the war, but but they were killing individually. They were shooting, they were hanging, they were doing, and they did have a crematorium, and they added a second one, right, in 44? Is that correct?
I think at first they didn't, they used the town, there's a town, Fürstenberg, across the lake that was the crematorium, and then the death rate started to become more than that town could handle, so they built one, and then they built a second one, which still is standing there, you can visit it. And then they had a thing called the youth camp, which was next to Ravensbrück, which was where, which was basically a death camp. And they were sent, and there were mobile gas units, and actually one of the things that I don't write about, but the early testing of the use of gas on humans was in a few camps, and it was also in Ravensbrück, but that's not in the official Nazi record because the Nazis were scared that if people found out that this was happening so close to Berlin on German soil to women, there would be political outcry. People would get upset about that. So they kept that out of the record, but we know about it because the doctors that were doing it wrote letters home to their wives, and we have those letters. So, and also because of Jean Mentillon, people like that keeping records, that knowledge is known now more and more. Yeah.
Next question's to your left with Connie, please.
How many perished at Ravensbrück?
How many perished? It's a bit it's a bit of an unknown.
Yeah.
The estimates go between 30 and 90,000. Again, because the Nazis were very interested in destroying all the records, and also because there were, like I said, there were children that weren't counted. Do you count all the children that died? There were people that were killed before they were even matriculated. So it was near the end. It was very chaotic.
Toward the end, there were so many women coming in because the Germans were emptying the camps to the east. In Poland, for example, the death camps, they shut down the gas chambers, and all the inmates were on forced death marches, basically. But a lot of women came pouring in from other camps, as well as from Warsaw. You know, when the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, you know, the Germans crushed Warsaw, basically leveled Warsaw, and women that were living there, they weren't resistors or whatever. They were basically, many of them were forced to come to Ravensbrück. So there were tens of thousands of women coming in, a lot of women from Auschwitz, Jews from Auschwitz. On the forced marches came. So there were so many people coming in that the whole administration collapsed. I mean, these women were not ever registered. There was no registration of them. So there is absolutely no way of knowing either how many women were at the camp altogether or how many died.
Next question's going to be in the front towards the center, please.
This is a question more so for Gwen, but how do you use Margaret's and Milena's story to kind of combat these social taboos and historical silences, you know, regarding homosexual men and women?
Actually, it's for you.
It's one of the stories I wanted to tell, and I did interview a bunch of historians on the sexuality of the camps. It was interesting because as I think I told someone this, that as I interviewed an older lesbian who was very much a historian, she said, "Well, you can't out them. That would be morally wrong." And then a younger one was, "But of course, like that's from the old time. Like it won't ruin their reputation to find this about them." So there's a shifting. There's shifting sort of ethics or morality around that issue even now as we speak. In fact, one of the things that it might be interesting is that there was an effort, I think it's from the 60s, of a group of lesbian survivors who wanted to put a memorial at Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück has a big wall, and all the different countries and different groups have created little memorials there in front of the lake because all the ashes were dumped into the lake. So it's sort of a kind of a cemetery memorial site. And they wanted to put a memorial for lesbians that were killed there, and it was opposed by male homosexual activists that said it would create a myth of persecution. And that battle, to have that memorial put there, just ended in 2024 when they finally put the memorial there. And that has been an effort of all kinds of historians to talk about sexuality and talk about what it meant, and all forms. I mean, there was obviously barter sexuality, there was rape, there was all kinds of levels of how the body was used or not used, and can love really exist? It's a complicated question, but I think that there are now known camp couples, and a few of them that have finally, the end of their lives, that were together for their whole lives, but then at the end we're able to speak about it. And so there's now an openness to talk about these passionate friends and what that meant. And I can imagine that if you find love in such a place, it's incredibly important and powerful. So I think it is a really important part of the story.
Next question's to your left towards the front with Connie.
Can you speak to the survival rate of Ravensbrück versus Auschwitz and some of the other camps that were, as I understand, complete families of people, right. Grandparents and adults and children, both sexes. What was Ravensbrück really there for, and what was the survival rate of that camp?
Well, the survival rate clearly was higher than Auschwitz. I mean, Gwen alluded to it. It was not an extermination camp. The extermination camps, the camps that were designed to kill immediately, almost all of them were in Poland, to get them out of Germany. They didn't want them in Germany. So Poland, like Auschwitz and Treblinka and various others, were in Poland, and that was obviously extremely high because the whole idea was to kill them. I mean, obviously there were people that the young and the fit who did work there, and most of them died, but that was the way you could survive. Ravensbrück, like many of the other German concentration camps, is a labor camp, but as Gwen said, it was slow death. I mean, the Germans had no intention of having any of these women survive. At the end, it just took them longer. They worked them to death the conditions were horrific. The food was almost non-existent. Ravensbrück was a petri dish of disease. So most women, it's really hard to say because we just don't know. But it did have a higher rate, but at the same time, 30 to 90,000 out of 120, 130,000, even more. It's still, it's still huge.
But they had gas chambers, and there was an acceleration of the murder and the gas chambers in the hunt. Yeah. And it's interesting. You write about how they were hidden, and they kept trying to escape, especially the Poles and the Jews that they were after, and I think. Maybe, I don't know which one of you wrote that. They killed 2,500 the week before Easter in 45. So there was an acceleration of the murder. And
the rate goes seriously up.
It just ramps up fast because they want to destroy all the evidence of the women that they were.
And it's very interesting. It's like this incredible adventure story at the end because they were trying to kill as many, and the Swedish Red Cross was doing their best to send in a rescue mission to get them out. So it was like, oh God, who's gonna win? Well, I mean, obviously a lot of people died, but the Swedes actually did get in there and in time to save. I think it was, the number is like 8,000, 9,000 women from Ravensbrück before the camp was officially liberated, which was a while later.
All the way to the back to your right, please.
Hello, and I guess this is a question for Lynne. Did Genevieve de Gaulle suffer in the camp because it was well known that she was the niece of General de Gaulle? And the second part of the question is, post-war, I understand they had a very close relationship. And did her experience have any influence on post-war French policy?
the first part, that's a really interesting question, because I think when she first went, when she was first arrested and then sent to jail and then went to Ravensbrück, de Gaulle was still, I mean, this was early 1944, so we didn't have D-Day yet. He was outside of France. And so while he was important, they knew about him, they were focused on French, you know, on the French and arresting and killing all the resistors in France. So the Germans weren't paying that much attention. And she was surprised that in fact, you know, they didn't seem to care that she was the niece of de Gaulle. Everybody in the camp cared. The inmates did, but they didn't. But then, you know, then came D-Day, and then came, he was clearly the leader of the resistance, and then became clearly the leader of France itself after D-Day. So all of a sudden, they took a great amount of interest in Geneviève de Gaulle. In fact, she was part of a plan by Himmler, who, toward the end of the war, like a number of Germans leaders under Hitler, decided to create their own separate missions to end the war, so they wouldn't be killed, etc. So Himmler tried to get de Gaulle and other Allied leaders to agree to a separate peace, and one of the things he dangled in front of de Gaulle was releasing his niece. De Gaulle resisted initially, but in the meantime, Geneviève was taken out of where she was and put into the prison block of Ravensbrück. Well, first of all, she was treated really well, and then she was put in the prison block, and she had no idea what was going on, you know, why all of a sudden this is going on. And it's still not clear exactly why they put her in the prison block. That there was some misunderstanding, but she was treated really, really badly. And then all of a sudden, she's released. I mean, it's just the weirdest story. But she was released early because de Gaulle, apparently, he insisted he had never given in, but I think he did give in, and he wanted her out. So she came out in February of 1945. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the second part of your question.
It was close to.
Did it affect his post-war politics?
They were very, very close. It's really interesting because I've written about de Gaulle a lot in my books, and you know, all of you know about de Gaulle. Nobody liked de Gaulle, or virtually nobody liked de Gaulle, especially Churchill and Roosevelt, especially Roosevelt. And he was just really difficult, to put it mildly, in every possible way, except with Geneviève. They were close right from the beginning of her life. She was closer to him than to her father. And he basically became her surrogate father. And they just had this extreme understanding of each other, and he was incredibly sympathetic to her. And I think they were very much alike. I mean, I think that's, you know, Geneviève was very quiet, very unassuming. She looked like, but she had a backbone of steel. I mean, that woman, she was a real leader, and was a leader in the camp and was a leader afterwards. In fact, she was really responsible for the creation of this women's organization. She ran it. I mean, and so she and de Gaulle were very much alike, I think, despite the fact that she was incredibly sweet and, you know, reserved, and everybody thought she was just, you know, the reality of Geneviève de Gaulle was not like her appearance, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nick Mueller, Gwen Strauss, and Lynne Olson.
Thank you.
You founded the museum. You can say whatever you'd like.
I just want to say two things. First of all, about both of their books, they're just wonderful. And the love story, The Passionate Friends, the way Gwen writes about their love and how genuine, authentic it is in the midst of this horrible place is just amazing, beautifully done. And love is love in a way that how they stole glances and just wanted to see each other. So it wasn't just knowledge that helped them survive. It was love, and it's beautifully told. And also that Germaine mentioned once that your life can change in just a moment, and what you took for granted as your freedom is all of a sudden gone, and you're in this horrible place. And so I think these two women and what they have written, as well as the women they've written about, are standing in for 30, 40,000 that didn't make it back, and they remember them. So thank you.
Thank you all. The ladies and Dr. Mueller will be outside at the book signing tables. It's now our lunch break. Please be back at 12:45 for our next session, Armies Afloat, featuring John Curatola with John McManus. Thank you.